Kristen, thank you so much for joining me here. It's such a privilege to be able to meet you, and we're here to talk about your new book about Australian airmen in a particular POW camp. And I've just read the book. Well, almost read the book. I'm just about at the end. So don't give away anything about the end.
No spoilers about they got home.
No spoilers. Yeah, that's right. But it's a wonderful, very human story that's a very valuable part of our wartime history. And so I was keen to get you on and just to have a chat about it. Now, for those people who don't know about you, why don't you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of a background?
Okay, well, firstly, thank you, Matthew, for inviting me to talk about the book. Advertisement.
Yes. I'll definitely put it up there, and there'll be a link sort of in the show notes with this video too. So if you're interested, just have a look in the notes. There'll be a link there for you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And of course, I will be sharing it as widely as I can. But just briefly about myself, I've written a number of books about Australian aviation, mainly biographies or taking a biographical perspective. I've been doing it for just over 2 decades now. I fell into it by accident. I bought the letters that Clive Caldwell, Australia's highest scoring fighter ace of the Second World War, and I read them and I thought, this is really interesting. And I wrote an article. I initially did a presentation to my local branch of the Military Historical Society of Australia. One of the guys said, there's a book there. And so yes, there was a book there, and then there was another book, and then there was another book, and so I write aviation history, but very selectively from the personal perspective. I write for again selectively for some of the military magazines. I write on my blog, do little snippets here and there. So I guess I can call myself an aviation writer.
So tell me a little bit about how you got into researching and writing about POWs. And I understand you made it a PhD.
I did. The PhD was sort of an accident or a pragmatic way of dealing with the problem. But getting into it again was, I guess, accidental in a way. I'd come across Jimmy Catanar's story when I was researching for my biography of Jack Davenport. And when they were flying to Russia, Jimmy was force landed and was captured. He was one of the Australians killed in the Great Escape. Now, because he exited stage right, so to speak, Jack Davenport stepped into his shoes and went on to a sterling career. And I always kind of wondered, well, what happened to Jimmy? I knew that he was killed, but what happened in between? How did he get to that position? But, other projects that never happened. But I also happened to be email friends with Alan Righetti, who was a pilot from 3 Squadron RAAF. And I first met him while I was doing the Caldwell research. And we emailed for quite a number of years. And he was always very supportive of my research. And he, of course, was in Stalag Luft III. So every so often he would let slip a story of his experience. And then, when you're getting towards the end of one project, you start thinking about the next one. And I was sort of thinking about, well, maybe it would be interesting to do something about the Great Escape, discover what happened to Jimmy, bring in Alan's story as in someone who was involved in the process, but obviously survived. But for various reasons, that didn't work out. So I then just thought, well, Stalag Luft III really is interesting. Why don't I research that? And again, I had problems, and it was because I am a biographer by nature. I am interested in what had happened to a person, to the extent that I want to write biographies, but you can't write biographies of so many people. And I certainly found that with Australia's few, writing biographies of 8 airmen carrying them through the Battle of Britain was a challenge. You couldn't do it for any more.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, okay, I'll tell the story of the camp, but I didn't have the personal skills to deal with sort of the broader story. I kept wanting to go back to the individuals. And I was actually at a book launch, and I was talking it over with a friend, and he said, have you ever thought of doing a PhD? And that sentence encapsulated the solution to my problem, because I would learn the skills to deal with masses of information and extract the telling statement, what captivity meant. I did. So I embarked on my PhD, and I had to unlearn a lot of things. You couldn't write biographies of 350 odd men. You had to have an argument. You had to do it. You had to write in a totally different language, and you had to deal with data evidence differently. But I got through that process. But right along the line, it was always the PhD was the means by which I could write the book, and I could tell the story of captivity. And during the process, I discovered that captivity didn't stop once they got on the boat to go home. For many, it lasted a lifetime. So a much broader project than I ever envisaged.
Okay, so you've got your PhD as the vehicle to tell this story. So now put us in the picture. So you've chosen a very specific camp. Now, a lot of people will be familiar with the Hollywood movie, The Great Escape. But can you just explain the camp, and maybe even why, why that particular, why did you keep it with that particular camp? There were a lot of, POWs around the world. And sort of set it up for us there.
Okay. Well, firstly, my writing and research has been very firmly established in the aviation world. So I have a certain understanding of airmen. So for me, looking at POWs and what happened to them if they couldn't fly, made a lot of sense. So Stalag Luft III was the most well-known camp, that and Colditz, and there weren't that many airmen in Colditz. So again, Jimmy, Alan Rigetti, my Air Force writing background, Stalag Luft III made a lot of sense. Pragmatically, it had more public recognition because of the film, because of the book. It also had a very solid core of Australians, not too many, not too small, so I could get a lot of evidence, or that was the hope. It also too presented a viable case study, because I read other accounts of captivity, PhD theses or books drawn from theses, or just general accounts by historians, and they would draw on huge pools of information, of records. So they would be making a statement based on, say, half a dozen similar experiences from a pool of, the British experience, 10,000, 13,000 POW, Airmen POWs or something like that. I'm not good with numbers, but a few statements from a very broad POW pool. So by looking at one camp, I had a smallish cohort, a manageable cohort. I had a core of Australians, so I could look at whether an Australianness was important. They didn't have the same kind of relationships that army chaps had, as in you rarely had a crew or a squadron falling at the same time, whereas you would have battalions coming into some of the larger army camps, or certainly large sections, large groups of individuals. So it emotionally it fulfilled my need to look at Alan and Jimmy and that, but pragmatically it was a well-known camp. From a PhD perspective, you could get good evidence and perhaps make very strongly supported statements.
And for those who are not aware, this was a camp that was administered by the by Luftwaffe, right? So
yes. So you had
they were all just airmen.
So you didn't have any of that tension with airmen in an army camp. So that's a good point. Thanks, Matthew.
Now, as you started to dig into the research, I'm just wondering what sort of thing, because you obviously had a certain amount of knowledge beforehand. What sort of popped up that surprised you about this story?
I guess it's like anyone who's seen the film and that sort of created images in your mind. There were things that were different from the film. That portrays the image that everyone, for instance, was involved in the escape effort, but that wasn't the case. So from that, you've got the statements that everybody was involved in escape or escaping. But when you look down at the evidence and you see where when people arrived, it could not possibly be true. So that surprised me. Also too, and this comes back from our very strong Australian appreciation of what happened to the prisoners of war of Japan. So many came back at the same time, looking frail, emaciated, damaged. And the airmen came back roughly at the same time, looking hale and hearty, fit and healthy. And so our imagination of captivity is, or our collective appreciation of captivity is that for the prisoners of Japan, it was traumatic, but for prisoners of Europe, it was a lark. We saw how much fun they had in the Great Escape. It was only a few who got shot, but everybody else enjoyed themselves. It was a bit of a lark. We have an escape literature which shows that captivity, again, was jolly hockey sticks. It was a bit like a schoolboy fun game. And the airmen themselves only talked about the good things. So there was no perception that captivity public perception that captivity under the Germans was a difficult experience. And yet I'm getting contemporary stories of psychological disturbance, psychological damage, and post-war, terrible stories of post-war traumas that all originated from captivity and the consequences on the men, the consequences on family. So that was probably the biggest surprise, that we did not know that they actually suffered. It was a different suffering, but you can't really quantify. You can't say, oh, that person suffered more than that person. It's an individual experience, and yeah, everyone suffers differently, and has different triggers for their trauma.
And before we started recording, and I was saying to you that I was watching this other documentary about the Great Escape, and one of the things that struck me in contrast to the Hollywood movie was these boys were very young. These were young lads. And without the sort of the life experience maybe to put in, to handle some of those difficulties of being in captivity. And I'm thinking about my own sons, about that age, in their early 20s, and just how they would deal with such a thing. And so, I get the impression from, the Hollywood movie that these are, sort of older chaps with a lot of experience, and maybe some of the senior ones were, but generally these are young boys.
Oh, yes. Well, one of the things I did for the PhD was the bell curve of ages.
Right.
And the average birth year was 1920. So they're 20 in 1940, they're 22 in 1942. So that was, age 20, 1920 to 23 was the average age in Stalag Luft III of the Australians. You had the old age pensioners, you had a couple of young chaps, you had, I think the youngest was about 19 or something like that when they were first captured. But stories of people celebrating their 21st birthday in camp, in captivity, and that will explain, in further research, some of the problems some of the men had when they were trying to reintegrate into society, because they left society almost as schoolboys, or they hadn't even had their first job. So how can you kind of pick up the strings when you didn't have them in the first place? You still lived at home with mum and dad. But certainly they were young, they didn't have the life experience. But at the same time, and this was hammered through to me very strongly by a chap that I had a long series of interviews with, Alec Arnell, that they had been brought up in difficult circumstances. They were the children of the Great War. They were the children of the Depression. So they had a very strong lived experience, or a large proportion of them had a very strong lived experience of adversity and making do, resilience, bouncing back. A lot of them had strong religious faith so that they could look outwards to somebody to give them, to God to give them strength. And a lot of them, they maintained their strong family ties. So even though it took a long time for letters to come, they still had mum and dad or their fiancés, their wives, assuring them that they were loved, that they were wanted, that they were interested in them, and that they were waiting for them. And then in camp, again, youth doesn't matter if you have a supportive network. And that they very much had that in Stalag Luft III. It didn't matter that the Australians were largely members of the Royal Australian Air Force. They had learned how to develop crew relationships or relationships with disparate personalities, and they carried that learning into camp. And the older men too, like one of my favourite stories is comes from Anne O'Byrne, the wife of Justin O'Byrne, who people may remember was our father of the Senate for a long while there. He was older and he was looked upon as either a bigger brother or a father figure. He was able to pass on his experience and his strength to some of the younger boys.
Now, one of the things that I get the impression with these Stalag Luft camps was that there's a certain civility because the administration, they were flyers as well, right? So it's there's a kind of a kinship. Now, and as much as there were difficulties, maybe in comparison to, say, POWs under the Japanese, there was a certain civility. Now, is that a myth, or am I getting that right?
It's a sort of thing. It's kind of contingent, as in, generally speaking, they like to think that, you know, we are airmen, they are airmen, the brotherhood of the airmen, we think alike, kind of thing. And that's why you do get the stories of chivalric actions. Pilots come down, they're captured by the Germans, they're entertained in the mess before they're packed off to interrogation and POW camp. And of course, civility oils the wheels so that you can have a decent existence. But yes, generally speaking, the RAF hierarchy got on with the German camp hierarchy because we are gentlemen and it helps make life easier. But it didn't always work like that. It depended. For instance, there were very fractious relationships when the medical staff were trying to get people who were suffering from psychological difficulties sent off to a camp where they could get proper psychological assistance, or there were more people getting on the repatriation list for psychological difficulties. The camp commandant, you know, he didn't believe the medical staff. He didn't believe that this was a problem. So there was fraction there, and in fact, he packed off the Australian doctor to another camp because they had quite a bad relationship. With the guards, there were reasonably friendly relationships, and some of that might have been because, you know, we have a common background. But at the same time, the prisoners of war generally didn't speak to the German guards. There was a language problem, but also unless they had a specific escape-related task, as in we want to get information, we want to get escape supplies, and then they would sort of weasel in or suborn the guards and develop that kind of a relationship. But when one of the guys, and this wasn't an Australian guy, you know, went round the bend, as they would say, and flung himself on the wire, a guard shot him because he thought he was trying to escape. This guy was clearly distressed. So there was very much the relationship of we are the captured, they are the captors, that relationship of power. And some of the airmen did say that they were living in that a situation of fear. They never knew what could happen.
Another interesting, I guess it's a psychology point here is that, and you mentioned someone was talking about the boys' first experience of the war was, being a pilot, being in the air, being sort of free, and now being in captivity, they've got their wings clipped, so to speak. There's a stark contrast to the freedom of being in an aircraft, to being shot down and then being in this very constricted environment. And I'm wondering if they had a harder job about it than maybe foot soldiers, or it was just a thought, because of that stark contrast between being in the air, being free like a bird, and then being in a cage.
Well, I can't compare sort of the airmen with the foot soldiers, and then with the airmen you've got a couple of different classes. You have the fighter pilot, who very much had that freedom, that individuality, as opposed to the bomber crew, and then you've got the pilot and the different mustering. So you've got different classes of airmen, so to speak. But at the same time, it was one of the theories I went in there to see if there were any differences in musterings, and long-term psychological effects, and for where I could pull out evidence, surprisingly, the fighter pilots manifested the least amount. And I think it was perhaps because, and this is going back to some of the stereotypes related to the types who were selected for fighter pilots, they were more individual, they were more creative or flamboyant, so that they perhaps could, and certainly in later life, a lot of them went into business or entrepreneurialism, that there was more of that individuality where they might have been able to adapt or flaunt the rules in a safe enough way that they could make the most of things. But at the same time, bomber crew, if they were fortunate enough to have crew members together, they actually fared quite well in camp, because that they had a pre-existing relationship, or they had been trained to form relationships with disparate men. Some of their problems in later life came from more of the emotional things, as in looking back and wondering about their place in the moral framework, the rightness or wrongness of their bomber activities. So I can't say if there is anything conclusive in airmen can adapt, but they certainly learned how to adapt, and they managed captivity, and maybe that comes from the fact that there is a lot of personal responsibility placed on airmen. The fighter pilot depends on himself for his life. The captain of a crew makes all the decisions in the bomber aircraft. The other musterings have very, very important specific roles. So they are used to management. And they very much manage their captivity, and maybe the brotherhood of the airmen, and that is something that I talked about, their propensity for fraternity, that they were able to build what I called, in effect, RAF Sagen within the prison camp. They had their own hierarchy. They spoke to their senior British officer. They listened to him and the rules that he laid down. So lots of mechanisms in place to help them manage and negotiate captivity.
Right. Now, one of the great travesties of this particular camp was, after the that big escape effort, was the murder of the 50 escapees, and which we're sure no one would have anticipated that was going to happen, and I understand that those bodies were cremated, and then the urns were brought into the camp as a warning, I'm guessing.
It very much was a warning. Keitel sort of said, we will cremate them, we will send them back, we will give them the lists of the dead. It will be a deterrent for further escapes. And the urns came back in dribs and drabs, and then they were sat on a table so the airmen could see the consequences. And the urns had labels, as in, this was Jimmy Katana, this was Albert Hake, this was Roger Bushell, the instigator. It hit at home, but it didn't have the effect that the Germans wanted.
Yeah, so tell us about that, because the Germans, there were certain rules of war, right, which were you know, they transgressed these grossly, and so that would have been shocking. But how did the POWs handle that, and what do you think was the German intent, and what was the outcome actually?
Well, certainly from the Hitler and his cohorts there, it was a retaliatory measure. We will kill them. It will be a warning. It's not going to happen again. When the news first came into the camp, as you could imagine, it was great shock. So there was that very human, emotional reaction. They were all shot trying to escape. Who was wounded? No one was wounded, which again didn't make sense. So you've got shock, you've got disbelief, but then you've got the inquiring minds. Hang on, this cannot be real. They 50 wouldn't have tried to escape. They all went off in separate directions. How could this have happened? So that they almost immediately concluded that this is a lie. They were not shot trying to escape. They were murdered. Yeah. When they heard the initial news, the airmen fell back on their Air Force experience, in that they almost immediately had, North Compound had a memorial parade. So then they knew the men were dead. It couldn't be a funeral, but we are going to honour them. They said prayers. They wore mourning patches, and they're very there's contemporary statements about how they went into mourning, just as you would if any member of the family died. And the Air Force has got rules and regulations about funerals, and these men had already buried men who had died in camp, so they knew what to do. And that ritual is healing to a certain extent. And that they wore the mourning patches for the rest of their time in captivity. When the urns came back and it hit them again that our friends are dead, and originally I think they were told 41 were killed and 50 urns turned up, so it was even more dramatic. Again, there was that emotional reaction, and then they wanted to do as we all do when people die in a mass death event. They wanted to honour them, so they constructed a memorial vault so that they could place the urns in, and then they had a little funeral ceremony when the vault was dedicated. So that they fell back on their training, but also there's a social experience in how to mourn their dead. But also too, they took meaning from the actual physical object of the urns. Creation was becoming more popular in our culture, but it wasn't the usual thing. And the Geneva Convention specified that airmen killed, POWs who died in captivity, were to be buried with the full rights. And honoured as servicemen. But they didn't comment on this contravention of the Geneva Convention, or this rarity. They looked at the urns and said, this is evidence of how much disruption we had created, because it had the name but also the place of cremation. So they had visual evidence of how far the airmen had got. Some had got almost out of Germany. Jimmy Kattener was captured, what was it, in Flensburg. Some got as far as Calais. They were all over Germany and the Greater Reich. So it was evidence of something that they had wanted to do, which was create disruption. So they took from that a victory, an achievement. Men had died, but we had done damage to the German war effort.
Yeah.
And it made sense of that tragedy.
Right.
And in a sense, the Great Escape film also makes sense of that tragedy by showing that it was a communal effort, and that we did, for a large proportion of the war, get one over the Germans.
Right. Yeah.
It just took a bit too far.
Yeah, I do wonder also what the psychological effect would have been on the camp commandant, and that these men of
Yeah.
would have a certain amount of honor, and to have to report this to the enemy.
Well, his career was immediately over. He was hauled out. They had other people come in and replace him. According to the men, some of the camp staff said, we had nothing to do with it. We are Luftwaffe. We are men of honor. This was purely Gestapo thing, and it was Gestapo, Kriminalpolizei. So they were able to fall back on that common bond of the airmen to distance themselves from it, and it was shocking because it just didn't happen. And relationship within the camp then did deteriorate considerably.
Okay.
And after that period, the psychological disturbance or the unsettledness, the nervousness, that heightened because they were living with more anxiety, they were living with more fear because they did have evidence of what could happen if they got out of line, or what would get out of line.
Yeah, in an interview that I saw from some of the survivors from the camp years later, and the question was asked, was it worth it? Was that escape worth it? And there were mixed responses, but one guy teared up and said no, doesn't think so.
If they think of the individuals, as in their friend was dead, and this comes through clearly in later life evidence, it wasn't. But then when you look at the effort as a whole, it was considered worth it. You had to kind of look at it from two perspectives, and if you separate yourself from the emotion, it was worth it. And you had to say it was worth it because 50 men died. You could have been killed if you had got out, or if you had got a lucky ticket to escape. So that personal thought is very, very complex. You can think two totally different things at the same time. But it was a terrible tragedy, and it was an absolutely vile occurrence. And researching it was very difficult, looking at the war crimes testimony of the perpetrators, and how they treated the bodies, how they treated the men before death and immediately afterwards. That is really disturbing.
I do remember a testimony of one German soldier who was ordered to do one of these murders, and he basically said, look, if I didn't do it, I'd be shot. So I'm between a rock and a hard place.
I know. And then ultimately in the war crimes trial, they couldn't use that as a basis for getting off. Orders isn't, you should have had the moral gumption to actually say no and then get shot yourself, the rationale. But
that's a hard thing.
When the basic human instinct is survival.
That's it.
I'll make this decision now and I'll live with it afterwards. Some people.
Now, you've done a brilliant job in covering life in camp, and like I said, I'm yet to get to the last bit on the homecoming, but I understand you've got a sequel coming.
I do.
About tell me what's the sequel all about?
Okay, well, basically the sequel is what happens next, what happens after they got home. The working title is Traumatic Legacies of Captivity, because for many, there were very traumatic legacies. And this is going back to the PhD research. I had access to over 80 medical files that had been compiled by the Department of Veterans Affairs, originally the Repatriation Department, where men were trying to claim medical compensation for their psychological disabilities after the war, which they could pin on their captivity experiences. So I had some really searing testimony about what happened to them, and how a lot of them couldn't function. So over 80, and of those 80, and then adding to it other evidence, like it might be a memoir or family anecdote or something like that. I had evidence for about a third, over 100 men. And from that, 2/3 of them had some kind of psychological disturbance, which was pinned back to captivity, which is actually quite a large number. And that was, again, the importance of having a closed case study, because it wasn't 80 people pulled from a huge POW cohort. It was 100 odd men in one camp over a period of time. So that's what I'm focusing on, but not just the damage to the men, but the flow-on effects for the family. So Kriegies does have the home front experience, how captivity affected wives and mothers, their personal response, how the deaths of the great escapers affected their families. But this one too has the new manuscript, Traumatic Legacies, that looks at the effect on the families as well. So it wasn't just the fact that a man might be quietly having a nervous breakdown. He might be perpetrating domestic violence. And I actually had quite a large number from, and it's difficult getting domestic violence evidence. But what I found was quite a large enough grouping to draw some quite strong conclusions. But then you had to be very careful, because it wasn't just the captivity experience, that there were the other social pressures, as in that they might not have had a stable job, or they might have had difficulty being employed, but at the same time too, their resistance or their resilience, their ability to function in society perhaps was worn down by captivity, and, as you pointed out, their extreme youth. So yes, domestic violence, psychological disturbance, or settling in culture shock, which they may have got over, but then late life reactivation. Round about 1990, 1995, that's when there was quite a large cohort of reactivated trauma. They had successfully tamped it down, but they were coming into retirement. You may remember the Australia Remembers program, where people were encouraged to talk about their experiences. So for so many years, because one of the things operating in Australia was a culture of silence. Don't talk about your war experiences. We want to move on. We've had 6 years of it. We're not interested. So yes, we just get on with life as best we can. We keep it within the family. But now you're actually encouraged to talk about it, and it reactivated memories. Round about the same time, we've got questions about the validity of the Bomber Command saturation bombing, and people were questioning their own involvement in that. So one of the things I discovered, that a number of the men appeared to have been morally troubled. So looking at moral injury as an issue and how they dealt with that. Suicide, so some of the men thought about suicide, some of them committed suicide, and it's directly related to their captivity experience. One man was so upset about the loss of one of the great escapers, the relationship that he developed. He just could not cope in the post-war life. I guess it's the tragic stories. Some people, and it's really hard to understand, but it's one of those things about being human. You feel guilty, not because you did something, but because you are one of humanity who did do something. Some of the men spoke about their terrible guilt about being in a world where atrocities were committed. And some of the testimony there, it was just absolutely tragic. But ultimately, Traumatic Legacies ends on a positive note, because even though there were difficult family relationships, domestic violence, or just fractious relationships, families adjusted to it, and they made the most of it, and they worked out how best to live with it. The men, just like they were in camp, they tried to manage their feelings. They fought for benefits from repat. Once PTSD was discovered, they actually had something to explain their feelings. Again, some people turned to God and had that religious support. They just showed their resilience. So, and also too, as I said, a third did not appear to have any kind of problems, or if they did, it wasn't enough to warrant troubling vets affairs with it. They got on with their life as best they could. There was joy in their lives. It was troubled but joyful.
So we have that sense of resilience. We've also got post-traumatic growth, which we're learning a lot about.
Very much so. Some men actually looked on it as a blessing. They wouldn't have got where they were without captivity.
Right.
They wouldn't have traded it in, no matter how difficult it was. They wouldn't have traded it in, because that built them as a person. So yeah, there's very much personal, emotional growth when you look at what happens next.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, what a fascinating study, and I'm so glad you're taking it to that next level to talk about, because the knock-on effect of war, it's incredibly impactful for us as a culture, and we need to talk about it. Like you said, we don't need this culture of silence. All right, well, I'll make sure that there's a link so that people can follow you and what you're doing. Well, thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you.
Do we miss anything? Is there anything that you wanted to cover but we didn't?
No, I think that was probably about all.
Okay, that's good.
Just that these guys are so interesting. Admittedly, I'm biased, but we can actually learn a lot from them. Their resilience that we can take into our own lives, how to manage adversity. We don't have to sit back and say, get up there and do something. Make the most of what you've got. They really teach some important lessons. I wrote a large portion of it during lockdown.
Okay.
And I was able to gain strength from them during what was a very scary time for all of us. And realizing the importance of friends and small things. Going for walks every day. So it's not just history. It's real. I might not have drawn the line that this is directly relevant today, but you can see, you can gain a lot by reading the experiences of these men and take them into your own lives. Yeah,
I certainly got that sense when I was reading, and I was always thinking, well, what would I be like in that situation? And and so as far as it helps you to have some self-reflection on and how to better yourself. So excellent. Well, thank you once again.
Thank you, Matthew, for the opportunity.
All the best with all your future writing, and we'll look forward to that sequel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, bye for now.
Bye.